William Robinson is professor of sociology at the University of California, here, Santa Barbara, and affiliated with Latin American and Iberian Studies program, as well as with the Global and International Studies program. His scholarly research focuses on macro and comparative sociology, globalization, transnationalism, political economy, political sociology, development and social change, and then finally immigration and Latin America and the Third World. We are very excited to have him here with us today, so please give your full attention and best to Professor Robinson.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for the people that organized this event. I can't think of a more urgent and timely event. We need to talk about the next system. And so I'm going to jump right into this. We're living in an unprecedented global crisis. In my view, the stakes have never been higher, and we've entered this period of great upheavals, of momentous changes, and of uncertainties. We truly face a crisis of humanity, which is the title of this presentation. If we want to talk about system change, we need to understand the nature of the global system in which we're living, and we need to understand capitalist globalization as the underlying process of our epoch, and we need to understand the nature of this crisis that we are in. We talk about crises in the social sciences, different kinds of crises, cyclical, structural, systemic. It's very clear that we are in an unprecedented structural crisis. What we mean by structural crisis is the crisis is so serious that you need to restructure the whole system. So our previous big structural crisis of world capitalism was the 1970s. And from the system's point of view, that crisis was overcome by capital going global, by capitalist globalization. Prior to that, there was a structural crisis of this world system in the 1930s, and the system got out of that by completely restructuring itself, the introduction of New Deal capitalism, social democratic capitalism, welfare capitalism, and so on. So we're in another really deep structural crisis, really the worst. The 21st century one is worse than anything that's come before it, and it threatens to become a systemic crisis. And what I mean by a systemic crisis is that the only way out of this crisis is to move beyond the system itself, to create an entirely new system beyond global capitalism. So this crisis that we are in, structural crisis, shares aspects with earlier structural crises, such as the 1970s, such as the 1930s, before that, such as the 1870s, but there are different dimensions, 6 that I want to point out, that are novel and new to this 21st century structural crisis and threatens to make it truly a systemic crisis. And so the first of these 6, everyone's been talking about this, but we want to analyze it in a little more detail. That the social polarization and inequality and out of control accumulation that we are seeing worldwide is simply unprecedented. Oxfam, the development agency based in England, released a report in January of last year which said that the richest 1% of humanity has more than 50% of the world's wealth. Now, that 1% and the 99% has been made very popular by Occupy Wall Street, of course by the Sanders campaign, but we want to understand that this is global. This is in every country throughout the world, and this is in the global system as a whole, this division between 1% having more than 50% of the wealth and 99% having to share the other 49% of the world's wealth. But it goes beyond that. The Oxfam report said that the top 80 billionaires at a worldwide level, and here I'm not just talking about the United States, these billionaires include Mexicans, Russians, Chinese, Indians, South Africans, Brazilians, Egyptians, and so on. The top 80 billionaires in the world, we're talking about the summits of the transnational capitalist class, has more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity. So that means if you have 3.5 billion people on one side, they have less wealth than the 80 top billionaires in the world. So this kind of inequality, we can't even fathom it. We can't wrap our minds around it. We've never seen anything like this. And moreover, the Oxfam report pointed out that between 2011 and 2015, that top 80 billionaires increased their wealth by 50%. While the bottom 50% of humanity decreased the wealth that they had by 50%. So there's been this direct, massive transfer to the top little upper crust of humanity. Truly the summits of the global ruling class. But there's a more significant or equally important type of inequality to focus on in this crisis, and that is the division of humanity into 80%, 20%. This is the new global social apartheid. That Oxfam report that I was citing pointed out that if you add the 1% plus the next 19% of humanity, that portion of humanity controls 94.5% of the world's wealth. That means 80% of humanity has only 4.5% of the world's wealth. So again, this is in every country in the world, and it's in the global system as a whole. And so this represents for us, for humanity, an unbelievable crisis. But it represents for the dominant groups this tremendous challenge. How do you purchase the loyalty of the 20% that can survive in global capitalism? And some can even prosper in global capitalism. How do you secure the loyalty of that 20%, and how do you divide that 80%? Co-opt that portion which can be co-opted, and repress and control that portion which cannot be co-opted. So there are all kinds of mechanisms at play. We can't go into detail in them all, but you're familiar with them. One is the manipulation of consumerist fantasies. So you think about consuming one day rather than challenging and overturning the system. Another one, and we're seeing this, of course, with Trumpism in the United States, but it's worldwide, is whipping up fear against ethnic and racial groups, oppressed groups, and against other scapegoats. And this, again, is worldwide, and it's coming into play violently all over the world as this crisis deepens. Yet a third one is manipulating insecurity. And again, I'm emphasizing that this is worldwide. And the key thing I want to emphasize with this global inequality is that such extreme inequality requires extreme violence and extreme repression. And this is what we are seeing. And global elites acknowledge now that this extreme inequality is leading to economic stagnation, to repressions, and the threat to recessions, and to the threat of collapse. And there's a transnational elite, or sectors of the transnational elite, now recognize that this extreme inequality, plus the violence needed to reproduce the system under these conditions, threatens their control. The control of the transnational elite threatens their power and threatens to destabilize the whole system. So what you're seeing now is that the transnational capitalist class is drifting. It has no direction, no response to this crisis. The response and the solution to this crisis must come from us from below. But I want to emphasize that this so-called enlightened section of the transnational elite that recognizes that the system will destabilize itself has introduced a new reformist discourse. So some among the transnational elite and their gurus, their intellectual gurus such as Piketty, or Jeffrey Sachs, Lawrence Summers. These are people that were talking about neoliberalism and the wonders of global capitalism just a few years ago are now talking about reforming the system. But we need to be clear, this reformist discourse is not enough. Transnational elite reformism does not challenge the structural underpinnings of this crisis of global capitalism. And moreover, it is aimed at saving the system from itself and from more radical efforts at more fundamental transformation from below, at saving the system precisely from the next system. So that's one dimension to this crisis which sets the 21st century crisis apart from earlier such structural crises. A second dimension, and we're all familiar with this, so I want to point it out nevertheless, is that the system is fast reaching the ecological limits of its reproduction. And we have already reached several tipping points in the terms of the environmental scientists, and specifically 3 tipping points: climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle. So for the first time in the history of life on our planet, human conduct, what we call the world system, is intersecting with and affecting the Earth system, what geologists and natural scientists talk about. And one book that's been on the bestseller list now for a couple years, Elizabeth Kolbert, she's a journalist who just published The Sixth Extinction. And she points out that we are now have begun this, she and others, the 6th extinction. But the other 5 mass extinctions on the 2.5 billion years of history of life on the planet were due to natural disasters that had nothing to do with life generating those disasters. The last one was a meteor, giant meteor that hit the Earth and made the dinosaurs go extinct. But now it's our own human conduct which is bringing about this 6th extinction. The Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Paul Crutzen coined this term, the Anthropocene, the new age that we have entered since the Industrial Revolution, and especially the mid-1800s and the massive use of carbon and the combustion energy. And so we're altering, and of course we know all of this, the composition of the atmosphere, acidifying the oceans. And so this ecological crisis cannot be underestimated. In the words of Naomi Klein, this changes everything. And she's right with that term. But here I want to point something out. On the one hand, capitalism, we only live now in a global capitalist system. There are no alternative systems in existence around the world. That is what we're facing. But capitalism alone is not responsible for this ecological holocaust which is looming. We know that there's this contradiction, human nature contradiction. We know that this very first human civilization, the Sumerians, collapsed when there was oversalination of the soil. And why was there oversalination? Because the ruling groups were pressuring the peasants, and they extracted the wealth from those peasants to overproduce, and the soil became oversalinated, and that civilization collapsed. And we know the collapse of the Mayan civilization, we know Easter Island, we know the disaster, ecological disaster in the former Soviet Union. So it's not just that capitalism puts us into contradiction with nature. But the point I want to emphasize, the second of the 6 dimensions of the crisis, is that we cannot resolve the ecological crisis within capitalism. The imperative to accumulate, the imperative to profit, and all of the control and the violence and everything necessary for that which overrides everything else means that we have to move beyond the capitalist system in order to resolve this ecological crisis and find a way of human beings living in harmony with nature. That was crystal clear in Paris in November and December, just this past November and December. So the transnational capitalist class, the transnational elite, will not resolve this crisis for us. That resolution is going to come from below and from our next system. The third dimension to this that set this crisis apart from earlier ones that I want to emphasize is the sheer magnitude of the means of violence and social control, and the magnitude and concentrated control that we're seeing worldwide over the means of global communications, the production and the circulation of symbols and of images, and the monopolization of the production and distribution of knowledge. Now, think about this for a minute. What do we know about the world, and how do we know about the world? How we act in the world is going to be shaped by what information we get about the world, and that information is so tightly controlled from above. Control of information, control of our perception of the world and what's happening in the world and how we understand it is a form of vicious control over our behavior, that is of social control. I just read an article yesterday thinking about what I was going to say here today that I forgot the Research Institute that published it, that for every 81 mainstream media coverages in the United States of Trump, there's one media coverage of Bernie Sanders. Okay, so 81 to 1. So I mean, just the example of the United States, I'm talking at a global level and at multiple dimensions here, but we see this in unbelievable concentration of the means of violence, social control, but also of images, symbols, and information. So we're seeing these frightening new systems of social control and repression. We are already living in a panoptical surveillance society in this age of thought control. And we're seeing the rise of violent control over space. The previous speaker was mentioning spatial dimensions of our existence, and the rise of what I call global green zones. When the US invasion forces occupied Iraq, they set up what they called the green zone in downtown, the center of Baghdad, these impenetrable walls and fortress really, and then there was the US military officials, the US occupying political elite, and the Iraqi economic and political elite inside the green zone, protected from the chaos and war and destruction swirling around them. But we're seeing all over the restructuring of space to accommodate the 80%, 20% global society, where that 20% or maybe a portion of it lives in these global green zones everywhere. You don't have to go far. You can go, well, right here to Isla Vista, but also to Los Angeles and so forth. But here I'm talking again worldwide. I want to say something about the means of warfare as well. We're now in the age of drone warfare, and the next generation is already being introduced, robot soldiers. Prison industrial complexes, we're familiar with them in the United States, but they are rising worldwide. That's one of the features of this new global capitalist system, the institutionalized spread all over the world of prison industrial complexes, of immigrant repression and control systems. And so warfare and violent social control become normalized and sanitized for those not directly at the receiving end of armed aggression and state repression. And so this inculcates complacency and indifference. And of course, there's the media and ideological apparatuses, the culture industries of the transnational capitalist class and the state. And they present an image increasingly of warfare and state violence and so forth as militainment. And I didn't invent that term, militainment, turning into entertainment, all of this around the world if you're not at the receiving end. And so we see the dominant culture criminalizing the poor and the oppressed and those who resist, and so forth and so on. And really, to summarize this third of these 6 points, again, these are 6 dimensions to the 21st century crisis, which really set this apart from earlier structural crises. We're seeing attempts by the system to make it impossible to think critically and outside the dominant world's view. A fourth dimension I want to emphasize here is that we are reaching the limits to the extensive expansion of capitalism, in the sense that there are no longer any new territories to integrate into world capitalism. In the late 20th century, the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, then followed by China and India and so forth, have been fully brought into the system. There's no, and when you go into the countryside all around the world, there's been a corporate takeover and the penetration of the capitalist market and class relations, even in the most remote regions of the world, in the third world countryside. So everything becomes now part of internal to the capitalist system. There's no way to expand anymore unless capitalism were to colonize another planet. And everything is being privatized, including where we are right now, healthcare and education. So everything becomes spaces of capital. And the thing here is that capitalism is like a bicycle. If you're riding a bicycle, you go forward. You continue to ride it. And if you stop pedaling, the bicycle will come to a stop and it will fall over. So if capitalism stops expanding outward and incorporating more and more into it, it enters into crisis and stagnation and the threat of collapse. And when it starts to collapse, the elites and those that control this system get very desperate, and then we're talking about the major conflicts that we are in right now. And one of the things this leads to is what I call militarized accumulation. What I mean by that is you open up new opportunities for accumulation and keeping the global economy and its profit-making going through state and corporate violence and repression, including making wars of destruction and then reconstruction and then destruction and then reconstruction, including introducing systems of repression of immigrants all over the world so that that actually becomes, and building walls and so forth, becomes a source of profit-making and keeping the system going, and so forth and so on. So we're really entering into what I call a global war economy. That's the fourth. The fifth novel dimension of this crisis is that we're seeing the rise of a vast surplus population inhabiting what Mike Davis has called a planet of slums. Alienated from the productive economy, thrown into the margins, and subject to these sophisticated systems of social control, to what I call a mortal cycle of dispossession, exploitation, exclusion. And when you look at the data, you're talking about this surplus humanity, in quotes, constituting at a global level about 35% of the world's population. In some countries, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the population. And so there are those pushed out and tightly controlled and subject to state violence and private corporate violence and so forth. But then there are those that are super exploited within the system. And we're using the term now, the precariat. Everyone is becoming precariatized. Precariat, that term comes from the proletariat, meaning people, working people, and precarious conditions of laboring in the global economy. So you combine that, that's the precariat. So increasingly professors, 7 out of every 10 classes in university at the United States is taught by adjunct professors that can work full-time with no benefits, no job security or anything all year round and live below the poverty line. So we're seeing all workers and working people around the world that are actually able to get employment have casualized work, part-time work, temp work, flexibilized work, contract work, informalized and de-unionized work. So we're seeing alongside the rise of the precariat and the rise of surplus humanity, we're seeing the rise of the new slavery. And that's made possible by surplus humanity and the imposition of this precarious nature of our existence. So there was just the Associated Press just won the Pulitzer Prize for exposing seafood prisons, seafood slaves in Thailand and Burma, people that had been promised jobs on the seafood industry, and they actually are put into cages. 2,000 were released, put into cages for 20 years, working literally as slaves in the 21st century global economy, and that seafood ends up in Walmart and Whole Foods and Albertsons and so forth. We see the rise of the new slavery in the Congo, for instance. Every cell phone we have, this computer right here, has these minerals that come from the Congo, and so local warlords round up slave labor to get those minerals, and then the warlords turn them for a hefty profit over to the transnational corporations that can say, it's not us, we're just purchasing the minerals. We see the rise of the new slavery in the sweatshops around the world, and we see it in the use of transnational immigrant labor, which is super exploited and super controlled all around the world. And that's another thing. The division of the global working class now into citizen and immigrant, a new axis of inequality worldwide. Not enough time really to talk about that, but I want to say that borders are not in our interest. It's not in the interest of the 80% of humanity. We want to tear down all borders, and any new system has to be talking about that. And in turn, then, we have the global working class. Working class meaning that people have nothing to do but sell, whether it's their mental labor or their physical labor, their bodies, have to turn it over to global capitalism because we've been dispossessed. But that global working class is divided between those who are super exploited, this precariat, and those who are marginalized. But either whether you're super exploited or marginalized, you face these complex systems of social control, and you face criminalization and militarized control. And so the dominant groups have this tremendous challenge that they're facing. Seen from above, how do you control the real and potential rebellion of surplus humanity? How do you contain surplus humanity? How do you contain these explosive contradictions of a global capitalism which is out of control and threatened with collapse? So that brings me to the sixth dimension of this crisis, which is novel, and then I'm going to conclude with some suggestions on what we want to be thinking about in responding from below to this crisis. The sixth dimension is a little more abstract, but extremely important. And that is, we are seeing a disjuncture between a globalizing economy and a nation-state-based system of political authority. So that raises the question for both dominant groups from above and for those of us from below, what political instruments are there available at a transnational level, at the level of the global system? And even though we need to be struggling and thinking about the very local, our own communities and our particular countries and regions, we also need to constantly be thinking about the whole global system, because even the most localized community now anywhere in the world is linked to this larger global system. So this presents this disjuncture between a global economy but nation-state-based system of political authority and elections and so forth, brings about a crisis of legitimacy as the system. And that might be good. For us from below, that's good. If the system is not seen as legitimate by masses of people will struggle to change that system. However, at the same time, this crisis of legitimacy means that the rulers get very desperate to try and reimpose legitimacy or find violent and other means of imposing legitimacy and maintaining control. And it also means that even if some members of the transnational elite are enlightened, in quotes, that they talk about a mild redistribution of wealth downward from some progressive taxation, which is obviously not a bad idea, but it's hardly enough, and so forth. Even if they want to do this, they don't have the instruments to do it. They don't have the instruments to rein in on the recklessness and the anarchy and the chaos of a globalized capitalist system. And what I call transnational state apparatuses are incipient. There's not enough power and authority to organize and stabilize the system. So elites themselves, at least the reformist elites, are clamoring for mechanisms of transnational political authority. And I want to add here, though, that the division of the world into some 200 competing nation states is also really a very poor political circumstance for the global working class and oppressed. Even when we take power in one place in this integrated global system, the structural power of transnational capital, the transnational capitalist class, and the violence they can impose, structural violence, such as through indebtedness and control by the banks, but also the direct violence through interventions and invasions and destabilizations, means that even when we take power in one place, and the model here, one of the models here is Greece. What happens in Greece, even when the left wins power at the level of the nation state. So The poor and the oppressed, and the exploited, the global working class, we struggle at the level of the nation state, but we need to be thinking about transnational projects of transformation. So that's the next system needs to be a global or a transnational system. Now, I'm going to conclude with a few discussion points, and not answer the discussion points, but put them out. Because the big question is, how do we get out of this crisis? And the answer to that question, or how we would go about answering it, has two dimensions. One, seen from above, how do we get out of it? Right, seen from the transnational elite, and seen from below, the mass of humanity in struggle. So I mentioned that the new transnational elite reformism seeks to stabilize the system, to save the system from itself, and to save it from more radical responses from below. And as we go talking now about the next system, we need to be clear that we want a system transformation, and we have to impose that perspective over the notion of a mild tinkering with the system, which is now coming from the mouths of some of these elites, no matter how good that tinkering might be, preferable to what we actually have now. So from the viewpoint of those from below, the objective is not just a project of mild redistribution within the prevailing structures of global power and the prevailing socioeconomic system, but redistributing power downwards and transforming the system towards one in which social need trumps private profit. There is a worldwide popular rebellion underway in the United States, but really it's worldwide. There are vital movements. To take the example of the United States, the environmental justice movement, the racial justice movement, the immigrant justice movement, the reinvigorated worker struggles. Well, in the United States, $15 an hour movement, but also in China, in India, in South Africa, wherever you go. The rise of resistance of Palestinians to Israeli apartheid and the increasing support for the BDS movement, the resistance of the masses in Honduras to the fascist system imposed, dictatorship imposed with support of the United States, in Haiti. It's so forth and so on. Wherever you go in the world, this rebellion is underway, facing many challenges, many difficulties, some setbacks, such as Egypt, such as Greece, but it's underway, and the initiative, we need to seize the initiative and stay on the offensive. Now, finally, I conclude with these as food for thought. What type of a transformation can we be imagining? And here are some ideas. I'm not going to elaborate on any of them, simply a list. First, we might want to be talking, actually use the term green democratic socialism. Secondly, because we're in the midst of this electoral campaign in the United States, and many people voting for Bernie Sanders, others not voting for him, others not participating in these elections, but that raises the larger issue worldwide, not just the United States here. Constantly think, the whole world, that's what I'm thinking of in my mind. How do you approach elections? Well, my view is an inside-outside strategy, meaning that you participate in elections when you can meaningfully make progress in these elections, okay? But you also don't fall into what I call electoralism, meaning that the popular agenda is subordinated to an electoral program. So that's what I call the inside-outside strategy. Third, we need to think of new forms of production and collective laboring and consumption which is in harmony with nature. Sure, we can talk about socialism, but it can't be any kind of socialism. We have to change the very way that we exist with nature and each other in the world. Fourth, we have to talk about the new face of the global working class. The global working class is multiracial, multi-ethnic, heavily female, and in fact led by women, flexibilized labor, informalized labor. We need a whole new concept of trade unions. A trade union includes people that are unemployed and underemployed and surplus humanity, and those that are transnational immigrant workers and so forth. And trade unions themselves and all our social movements need to be transnational. We start organizing our very communities, and we go beyond these artificial borders that are so destructive to us. And so that leads to another point, another food for thought point here, that we need global citizenship. And what I mean by that is abolish national citizenship, because that divides humanity into those that have the privileges in a particular nation state and those that don't. And along with this, we need transnational consciousness. That is, the people moving beyond national consciousness. We need transnational radical consciousness, revolutionary consciousness from below, and this involves also building cultures of social solidarity all across borders around the world. And I would have much more to say, but I see that I have about 2 minutes left, so I'll stop right there. Thank you.